Those of you who work as language translators and/or interpreters, or have in the past, what is the most awkward or uncomfortable conversation that you have had to convey? I was a conversation teacher for adults in Japan who wanted to practice more natural English, not strict formal grammar, but conversational. Not quite an interpreter but one student was an 80-year-old man the others called Mr. Dictionary because his vocab was seriously exhaustive. There were very few words that could stump him, usually some type of slang. On the rare occasion he brought a printout to ask about a new word, I would get both excited and nervous to see what it was. This was in 2007. One day he pulls out a paper and says, I heard a news story about a scandal with an American radio host insulting some athletes. Please tell me, what does this mean? And with all eyes in the class waiting for my wise translation, he loudly and carefully pronounced, nappy-headed naps. I wasn't a translator but I worked at a place that captioned telephone calls for customers who were hard of hearing. We only heard one side of the phone call, then basically repeated what we heard into our voice recognition software and then corrected it on the fly. Most of the conversations were boring old people talking to other old people, 50 people in a row calling in to vote for Dancing with the Stars. But ever so rarely you get a good one. Mine was what I'm assuming was a deaf young lady and her boyfriend because the conversation very quickly turned from how are you doing to I wanted to tie you spread eagle on the bed and lick you all over. This continued for about 15 minutes, but the best part is all the cubicles around you hearing you loudly and very clearly speak, so the voice recognition doesn't frick up. Graphic, depraved saxophone acts while they are trying not to lose their stuff laughing and still keep up captioning an old lady's cookies recipe. My elderly parents spoke English very poorly and I often translated for them. After my father passed away, I took my mother to the Social Security office to take care of paperwork. One of the questions they asked was whether there were any other potential beneficiaries of my father's benefits such as other children or ex-wives. Being an only child, I immediately answered, no. My mother asked me what the question was. I interpreted with my answer. She looked at me sheepishly and answered, that's not exactly correct. It was then, at the age of 50 in the Social Security building, that I learned that my father had previously been married and had had a child. Mother and baby died during childbirth. I recently had a similar situation while helping an elderly man with his U.S. naturalization application. If you're over the age of 55 and have been a permanent resident for over 15 years, you can do the application and take the test in your first language. Anyway, his adult daughter was interpreting but decided to answer questions on his behalf instead. I realized what was happening, and reminded her that he had to answer for himself. It was a good thing, too, because it turns out the question she just said no to was actually a yes. The question was, have you ever served in a police unit? He hadn't mentioned to her that he'd been a policeman before she was born. If I'd simply checked no, USCIS would have found that job and accused him of lying. Being a policeman in your home country doesn't disqualify you from citizenship, but lying on the application is perjury and can get you deported. I was so relieved that we dodged that bullet. Okay, so my parents are divorced and my dad is deaf. He's not the brightest fellow, so I sort of manage his medical stuff for him when his parents passed away. Now typically I'd book a sign language interpreter for medical appointments so I can just take notes and ask questions, but this time I didn't bother, figured I could just interpret. Now Dad had a new girlfriend, and I had the joy of interpreting my father's struggles with EDM music dysfunction. See, his new girlfriend, who was 10 years younger, was looking for more frequent performances than Dad could muster. So we got in depth about how frequently was appropriate for man in his late 50s and then had to discuss the risks of EDM music going on too long with Viagra. Yeah, I always book an interpreter now, and no, I never did figure out the correct sign for EDM music. So you're saying a deaf guy who's not too bright, in his late 50s, is getting laid more often than most of us Redditors. Not an actual translator, but my parents don't speak English. And I used to go with them to doctor appointments to translate. I was approximately 14 and my mom was pregnant. The NP told me to ask them when was the last time they had saxophone and then proceeded to tell me to translate saxophone positions they could partake in while my mom was pregnant. I didn't want to tell my parents or translate anything, but she kept stressing that it was good for them. I don't think my parents understood me or wanted to understand what I was trying to tell them. Long time ago, I did a pro bono interpreting gig for a community health care clinic. The doctor asked me to help call a woman who had come in for a pap smear to tell her she had a stud. She insisted it was only a cancer test and hung up on us. We had to call her back. She didn't answer the phone. I work tech support and often have to use a language line. My favorites are Asian languages and when people are mad. The interpreters, bless their hearts, will faithfully translate, but every so often will say, they are saying not kind things about you personally. The company I work for has a Spanish translation team that I use very frequently and know all of them. We basically do customer service. The most awkward conversations is when you have an irate person on the other line that is cussing you out. Our translators are supposed to translate word for word unless vulgar language is used, then they can summarize. Basically what I hear is about a minute of someone screaming at me, using multiple choice words that I can recognize as curse words, then the translator, translating, essentially, they are not happy with your answer. It's awkward for everyone because the translator is basically getting yelled at and has nothing to do with anything other than he picked up that call, and I have to just sit there for minutes at a time listening to someone scream and a short 5-word translation. The customer usually catches on after the first tirade or two that there is no point and they should just calm down and be a decent human being and talk it out. This may not be awkward or uncomfortable per se, but I once worked for an American teacher in Taiwan who expected his interpreters to be able to translate puns into another language. He did not or would not understand that a pun in English isn't a pun in Chinese. I can only assume sometimes this is why you hear stories about the translation being something like, they are trying to make a joke. Please laugh, I'm a translator, which means I only work with the written word. Not normally anything particularly juicy. However, I once had to deal with a landlord writing to Facebook to try and get Facebook to take down derogatory comments from his tenants. Basically, the landlord was accused of giving apartments to people who would sleep with him, so I had to translate a whole bunch of comments calling him a dog, saying the whole tower block had been under his desk, etc. Someone called him the little version of Dominique Strauss-Kahn, which I thought was pretty hilarious. I was interpreting for a high school teacher who was participating in an event to try to get dropouts to come back to high school in a majority Hispanic neighborhood. Anyway, the school gave us a list with addresses that we had to go to try to persuade the kids' parents. We go to this one house and ring the bell, the mother answers. I start translating what the teacher was saying and we go back and forth with the mother, asking her to see the kid, let's call her Maria. The mom kept insisting we couldn't talk to Maria and the teacher kept giving the whole spiel about dropping out and to think of the future, etc. About 10 minutes into the conversation, the frustrated teacher wants me to ask the mother why on earth couldn't we talk to Maria, to which the mother breaks down crying and says that she died a week before from a long illness, that's why she had dropped out. Ensues the worst and most awkward maybe 5 minutes of our lives, between apologies and condolences. Needless to say, we didn't go to any other house that day. By the way, the school turns out was aware of the kid's passing but had forgotten to take her out of the list. Shake my head, similar to others, not an actual translator but my parents spoke poor English when I was younger. When I was 12 they filed for bankruptcy and took me to the lawyer's office to translate for them. Having them go through and tell me everything they blew money on was extremely uncomfortable. Now as an adult they get offended when I don't want to take financial advice from them. I was a Spanish medical translator for a while, and there were some pretty bad ones, but one really stands out above the rest. I followed a nurse into a room where the patient was waiting. Now, I know nothing about the patient, I'm only there to translate what the nurse says, so when the nurse says, "You're pregnant," I gave a huge smile and went, "Estás embarazada." Patient stares in shock for a second, and then bursts into tears. The nurse stammers a bit, and then goes, "No bueno." The news we had to give was bad enough, but the fact that I thought it was supposed to be a happy announcement made it 10x more cringe. Ha 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 he 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 ha. If you enjoyed this video please like it and subscribe to Reddit Said It, or don't. I'm not your boss.